Before I speak before a crowd, I like to prepare myself. Of course, the first step is figuring out exactly what it is I'm going to be saying. But I also need to get into the proper frame of mind to get plenty of rest before speaking so my energy level is good and to set a proper mood with the environment. In our home church, I try to create an environment that is free from distraction and is comfortable. That's why before anybody even gets there, I set the thermostat for a comfortable temperature and I shut the blinds so that the squirrels scampering around in the wall in the backyard don't become the main show. Well, Paul was about to give a very important speech in the temple courts, and he felt passionately that it was a speech he really needed to give. But I've got to give Paul credit here. I don't think I could have given a speech in the conditions that he faced. First, he was attempting to address a very hostile crowd. His audience didn't even like him. In fact, just a few moments before, they tried to kill him. And that leads to his physical condition. He had been mugged in the temple courts and beat up. So by the time he gets up to speak, he might have a couple teeth missing, some broken ribs, maybe a fat lip, who knows what else. If I were in that condition, I would have appreciated a nap to enable me to recuperate from such a beating. But not Paul. Beaten and bruised, Paul insisted on giving a speech to his haters. In his mind, perhaps he could persuade them to consider Christ. We see the story in Acts 21, verse 37. As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" "Do you speak Greek?" he replied. "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists to go into the wilderness some time ago?" Paul answered, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people." After receiving the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd. When they were all silent, he said to them in Aramaic. And we'll get to what Paul said here in a minute, but let's look at what we've read so far. Lysias, the Roman commander, made an assumption about Paul, and he believed Paul was an Egyptian. And not just any Egyptian, but an Egyptian revolutionary and troublemaker. And why would Lysias be thinking these things about Paul? Well, the historian Josephus said that there was an Egyptian who was a false prophet and stirred up several thousand people. The man led them into the desert and from there to the Mount of Olives, where he promised that the walls of Jerusalem would fall at his command and allow them to easily overtake the Roman army and bring about the downfall of the Roman Empire. Well, that's a tall order. And as it turned out, the walls didn't fall. Instead, Governor Felix arrived on the scene with heavy troops, killed 400 of them and took another 200 captive, and the rest scattered. Felix was always brutal and heavy-handed when it came to crushing revolts. So many people died, but the Egyptian who started the whole thing escaped. Well, certainly, the people of Israel would have liked to lay their hands on this guy who caused so much trouble. When Lysias saw the riot in the temple, he assumed the Egyptian was back, causing trouble, and the Jews were attempting to kill him. But the commander's view of Paul changed when Paul spoke to him. Paul politely asked the commander, "May I speak with you?" The commander would be surprised to hear such a refined manners from an agitator. But Paul spoke in Greek. It was common for a Palestinian Jew to know some Greek. But Paul's Greek was polished and fluent. Paul knows the language as well as any native Greek speaker. So, Paul appears to be very well educated. So the commander changes his mind about Paul. Paul obviously is not the Egyptian revolutionary he thought he was. Then Paul goes on to tell him that he's a citizen of Tarsus. And Paul even describes Tarsus as no ordinary city. Back then, it was a status symbol to be a citizen of an important city such as Tarsus. So when Paul mentions he's a citizen of the extraordinary city of Tarsus, the commander would again think more highly of Paul. So the commander started out thinking that Paul was a no-good criminal troublemaker. But in just a few short minutes, he discovers Paul is not that guy at all. Instead, he's polite, he's well-spoken, he's educated, and he was a citizen of an important town. So Paul asks Lysias if he could speak to the crowd. And the commander gives him the green light, so Paul stands before the people and begins to speak to them in Aramaic. And Aramaic would be the mother tongue of the Jews living in Palestine. So he spoke to them in the language that they would be most comfortable with and could understand best. Besides, if he continued to speak Greek as he addressed the crowd, he would have insulted them since they already believed that Paul was much too friendly with the Gentiles. We pick it up in Acts 22, verse 1. Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense. When they heard him speak to them in Aramaic, they became very quiet. Then Paul said, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city. I studied under Gamaliel and was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. I persecuted the followers of this way to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison, as a high priest and all the council can themselves testify. I even obtained letters from them to their associates in Damascus and went there to bring these people as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished. Well, Paul began his speech emphasizing his strong Jewish background. First, he was brought up in Jerusalem. Paul was born in Tarsus and lived the first few years of his life there, but he spent most of his school days in Jerusalem. And we don't know if his parents moved to Jerusalem when he was young, or if they sent Paul there to get a good education. Secondly, he studied under Gamaliel. Gamaliel was a highly respected teacher of the law in the Hillel tradition. And Hillel teaching had great influence in Palestine. Since he studied under such a respected teacher, Paul was well trained in Jewish law. He was a scholar and knew the Old Testament very well. He also knew the traditions of the Pharisees. So he knew all of the purity laws, the regulations regarding the Sabbath, procedures regarding the sacrifices and the festivals, and many other rules regulating every part of daily life. And he would have understood the Torah and the temple as being central to Jewish life. And he was like them, so zealous for the law that he earlier persecuted Christians who he thought had disrespected it. Now we understand the word zealous as meaning passionate about something. But in this Jewish context, it went further, and it meant a willingness to use violence to defend the Torah. In Paul's day, Jews who were zealous for the law and wanted to be free from Rome were called zealots. So Paul was attempting to win this crowd over. They were ready to kill him for not being Jewish enough. And so he spoke about his strong Jewish history in order to persuade them he had not abandoned his roots. Paul hoped that listing all his Jewish credentials would convince his hearers that he wasn't the person they thought he was, and they would listen to all he had to say. We pick it up in verse 6. About noon, as I came near Damascus, suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice say to me, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? I asked. I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting, he replied. My companions saw the light, but they did not understand the voice of him who was speaking to me. What shall I do, Lord? I asked. Get up, the Lord said, and go into Damascus. There you will be told all that you have been assigned to do. My companions led me by the hand into Damascus because the brilliance of the light had blinded me. A man named Ananias came to see me. He was a devout observer of the law and highly respected by all the Jews living there. He stood beside me and said, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that very moment, I was able to see him. Then he said, The God of our ancestors has chosen you to know his will and to see the righteous one and to hear words from his mouth. You will be his witness to all people of what you have seen and heard. And now, what are you waiting for? Get up, be baptized, and wash your sins away, calling on his name. When I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw the Lord speaking to me. Quick, he said, leave Jerusalem immediately, because the people here will not accept your testimony about me. Lord, I replied, these people know that I went from one synagogue to another to imprison and beat those who believe in you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I stood there giving my approval and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. Then the Lord said to me, Go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles. So Paul gives his Christian testimony. He started his speech by telling them they had nothing to fear. He was Jewish just like they were. But slowly, he reveals that although Jewish, he has accepted Christ as a Messiah. He is a Jewish Christian. This is the second time in Acts we've come across Paul's testimony. Luke recorded how Paul accepted Christ on the road to Damascus in Acts chapter 9. And Paul's basically retelling the same story with a few tweaks to better relate to his Jewish audience. And so we see that Paul met them where they were and tried to lead them from there to Christ. That's a good strategy for us as well. When we share Christ with other people, it's good to first establish a common ground, to build a relationship with them. If we isolate ourselves from the world and preach at them from a distance, why should we expect people to listen to us? There's an old saying that says, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. When Paul wrote the church at Corinth, he said, even though I am a free man with no master, I have become a slave to all people to bring many to Christ. When I was with the Jews, I lived like a Jew to bring the Jews to Christ. When I was with those who followed the Jewish law, I too lived under that law. Even though I am not subject to the law, I did this, so I could bring to Christ those who are under the law. When I am with the Gentiles who do not follow the Jewish law, I too live apart from that law, so I can bring them to Christ. But I do not ignore the law of God, I obey the law of Christ. When I am with those who are weak, I share their weaknesses, for I want to bring the weak to Christ. Yes, I try to find common ground with everyone, doing everything I can to save some. I do everything to spread the good news and share in his blessings. Paul isn't faking it, pretending to be more Jewish with the Jews and then pretending to be less Jewish with the Gentiles. Rather, he relates with people where they are so that he can win some of those people to Christ. Well, in his testimony, Paul introduced Ananias. He described Ananias as a pious Jew, a strict observer of the Torah, and a person held in high esteem by the Jewish community in Damascus. It is interesting because in Acts 9:10, Luke introduced Ananias as a Christian disciple. So which is true? Well, they're both true. Just as Paul is a Jewish Christian who did not give up being a Jew when he became a Christian, so is Ananias. For Paul, Ananias was the link that helped Paul, a brand new Christian, become acclimated in the faith and introduced to the Christian community. So Paul introduced Ananias as someone much like himself, that his Christian faith in no way detracted from his loyalty to Judaism. Ananias is presented as quite Jewish, but also fully Christian. Paul then tells of his call for missions that he received in the temple. Paul received a vision in the temple in Jerusalem the first time he returned following his conversion. And one reason that Paul may have included this in his speech is that he had been accused of defiling the temple. And so he wanted his audience to understand that he had great respect for the temple and even received his call from God there through a vision. In many ways, Paul's vision in the temple parallels the call of Isaiah in the Old Testament. Just as with Isaiah, Paul had a vision of the Lord, and both experienced a call or a commission. Both were told that the people would resist their message. The difference is that Isaiah was told to remain in the city in the face of the resistance, but Paul was told to leave the city. Well, even though God told Paul to leave, Paul really wanted to stay. He believed that his testimony would be of great impact to the people in Jerusalem. The people in Jerusalem knew that his former life was one of persecuting Christians, even participating in Stephen's death. To see now that he embraced Christianity would be a powerful message that something dramatic must have happened to him that completely changed his life. And he wanted the Jews in Jerusalem to experience that change for themselves too. And also in Paul's mind, if he won some of the Jews to the Lord, perhaps it would compensate for all the damage he had done, especially in the killing of Stephen. But God had something else for Paul to do. To take the message of Christ to the Gentiles. God knew that the Jews in Jerusalem would not accept his message, that he would be effective elsewhere as he took the gospel to the non-Jewish world. So that's our story today. So what is the takeaway in this story? It is that we need to be bridge builders to Christ. As we saw in Paul's letter to the church at Corinth, he wrote, "I try to find common ground with everyone, doing everything I can to save some." And so he does his best to relate to his Jewish audience so that finding common ground, they'll listen to him and some may accept Christ. As Christians, we should never compromise who we are. We should not, for example, adopt immoral activities so that immoral people can better relate with us. I heard a sermon once in which the speaker said that he likes to go to bars because that's where the sinners are. Well, maybe. But Paul also teaches that we should avoid activities that might cause a brother or sister in Christ to stumble. What we should do, without compromising who we are, is to find a commonality with people. When Paul was with the Jews, he had his Jewishness in common with them. When he was with the Gentiles, he related with them differently, still finding common ground. And that's how it should be with us. Common ground. It can be the hobbies we're involved in, the books we read, the places we've lived, the pastimes we enjoy, and so on. A few weeks ago, Judy and I were walking up the back of Godey Hill to the Quartz Hill water towers. And as we were coming down the hill, a lady approached us from behind. She was running. And as she was running, her phone was playing what sounded like a Bible study or a sermon. Well, she was polite, telling us that she'd give us plenty of space when going around us. This was social distancing, after all. And after she passed us, she looked back and said, "I'm listening to Truth for Today. It's a great app for learning about the Bible. Truth for Today, check it out." We thanked her, and she went on her way. But in less than a minute, that lady made a connection with us. She found our common ground. We were hiking, and she was running. And she told us she would give us space. Then in a friendly, natural way, she introduced us to Christ. She didn't know that we already knew Christ, but that's okay. There was nothing pushy, nothing awkward. The ice had been broken, and she simply shared Christ. Find the common ground. Be a friend, and then lead your friend to Christ.